Hello, welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 80th, can you believe it, new social environment. I'm JC, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation with the artist, Michael Joo, and the Rail's own art scene editor, Amanda Gluibizzi. I had the pleasure of editing a studio visit video with Michael, and it was incredible. And I am really psyched for this conversation today. We are also incredibly lucky to have the poet Sharon Mesmer here, who will read to close us out. Now to introduce today's host. Amanda Gluibizzi is a familiar face around here, an art scene editor at the Brooklyn Rail and an art historian. She is the co-director of the New Foundation for Art History and the author of the forthcoming book, Art and Design in 1960s New York. And we are in very capable hands today. Amanda, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, JC. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this 80th episode of the New Social Environment. Wow, it's been a long time. So I'm so pleased to have a conversation with and to introduce artist Michael Joo today. Michael Joo is an artist whose multivalent practice encompasses sculpture, painting, printmaking, photography, installation, video, and performance, and probably even more media that I am listing currently. He graduated with a BFA from Washington University in St. Louis and an MFA from the Yale School of Art. Along with Do-Ho Suh, he represented South Korea at the 2001 Venice Biennale and was included in the 2000 Whitney Biennial. His installation at the National Museum of Asian Art, which is part of the Smithsonian, called Perspectives Michael Joo, was on display from July 2016 to July 2017. And he participated in 2013's Come Together, Surviving Sandy, curated by the Rail's very own Fong Bui. While Michael's work has been described as cyclical, he himself calls it a, quote, cumulative practice, which I really, really love, something that generates new ideas and exploration for himself and his viewers. When we spoke yesterday in preparation for this talk, Michael told me that, quote, to empathize with a rock is very difficult. That is true, but it is perhaps one of the things that his art tries to help us with. So I'm thrilled to have Michael here to talk with us today. So welcome, Michael. First, let's talk about this weird time that we find ourselves in, which of course was one of the impetuses for this entire series. Can you speak a little bit about the process in the studio? What do you do when you go into the studio, and whether or not you found that it's changed or shifted during this period of quarantine and social distancing and reflection?
Yes, thanks, Amanda, and thanks to everyone, Fong and JC and everyone at the Rail and everyone for being here. Yeah, this moment is such a it's amazing to me how this moment has been unfolding. However, everybody gauges the progress and their kind of movement through this space and time is different. But I myself have found myself measuring almost in weeks. It's almost like everything is recalibrated every week. There's something new from my perspective in Red Hook, which is not, I guess, the center in New York, but has its own kind of reverberations. And that kind of unfolding of time has been really interesting. I watched myself overlaid with that chronological time, note that the circles, almost like the ripples of your travel, of where we go from inside the house, have expanded as well. So it's like my routine has gone from home only to the backyard, to fixing every bit of the house in cycles with the family, to the store, to the studio finally, to again another store to help my cousins along with their 27-week prematurely born baby.
Oh my goodness.
Et cetera, getting supplies and gradually expanding and expanding. At the same time in the studio, when I was able to get in, I found myself, tunneling into the storage and really looking at everything we have, assessing what's there and all the resources, and also, some of the work of the past. And that tunneling backwards through time was also very interesting. I think it had a lot of effect on how we've been thinking about, and how I've been thinking about the present and where we are right now. I think we had I felt a real, huge kind of whiplash almost from this period of extreme introspection and isolation into the necessary and incredibly urgent jump to looking immediately outside. So eventually those circles came to encompass protests, and the circles came to encompass testing after the protests, and the circles came to involve other things, more institutional things, but not by the way that you'd normally think. And they came about through a lot of urgency, and some of that urgency in the studio overlaid with this kind of stillness of time and the kind of the isolation where I'm really alone there as well when I am there, with my work and some of my past has really been profound to me.
One of the ways that you have described your work quite frequently is that you're interested in kind of occupying a liminal space. And it certainly does seem like we are in one currently, right? Not least because we don't really have a lot of options for ourselves. And so we're kind of in a weird sort of holding pattern in which we kind of like reverberate in and out.
Yes, yeah, we're definitely in this liminal kind of moment, I think. One thing that's been drawing me to those spaces, they're undefined and they're often constructs. And sometimes those constructs, as you look deeper into them, if you really explore them and actually go to the mountain, so to speak, and be in those and experience those spaces and observe, you might notice clues to the identities and other kinds of spaces that have been generated by the very fact of this construct. So even though this is a construct made by people, made by humans, that physically doesn't exist perhaps, it becomes real. And the kind of reality that forms around it is undeniable. And so I think that's in a large way might be an appropriate way to describe the liminality of now. The urgency that's been snowballing and building up at the edges of this space, this in-between space, are finally getting some expression. And
so interesting. Madeline, if you wouldn't mind starting the slideshow so we can get into Michael's work. As I mentioned in my intro, Michael has this very incredibly broad practice that encompasses so many media and has so many interesting ideas flowing through it. If those of you who are participating saw the little slideshows that the Rail has put up just on Instagram, for example, just seeing the different works that scroll through on those little videos is really, really incredible. When I was preparing for this interview, one of the things that really struck me, though, is that perhaps a through line in your work is an interest in indexicality. The index, for those of you who want the refresher, is something that indicates that there was a presence. So for example, a footprint in the snow suggests that someone made that footprint. And so what I identified in Michael's work is something that is actually interested in this presence. And it ties both your early work to your later work and also the work that you make that is more abstract with work that's more representational. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that that indexicality that you mentioned is very important. In that first image that we looked at, with the number of calories, for instance, those were important works that have been running through my practice. And that record is something I started when I first came to New York and just before. And that was a kind of a practice of calculating calories of presence. If performance was missing, if action and resources weren't there, and if the human were gone, what would the energy expended have been? And those things have grown. And the indexicality indicated in this image, for instance, which is generated by metal stamping into aluminum and photographing it, and then in a transparent ink, and then literally developing that in space is a reference back to photography, kind of a place with a definitive role, I think, in indexicality in art. And in this case, that the index of the human presence indicated is the number of calories that you could consume if you ate an entire human body. So this is the number of calories of energy the body has to offer. It has a sister piece, which is called acquired, which is the number of calories per millisecond the body consumes itself, it takes to the body to consume itself based upon the kind of physiology of the Buddha when he was moving towards enlightenment and fasting ascetically, as paired with real data from sports medicine and polar exploration and the body's kind of own consumption of itself. So these things are really factually, I guess, and intensively researched, but ultimately there's a leap, and the proof is yet to exist. For me, the substitute for proof might be maybe the evidence that follows the scientific method. More so is the fact that the evidence jumps medium. And by using multimedia, by jumping from one stream to another, the proof doesn't necessarily exist in one stream, but rather is evidenced in another. And so the proof of image via the chemical reaction of the silver on the surface, resulting in a numerical figure that refers back to this impossible kind of proposition, is where some of this work sits. And it's kind of at the core of a lot of it, which is why I thought I'd start with that. But
even if we move forward a couple of slides, for example, number 2, these 2 images, you're dealing with huge piles of salt, and then in the 3rd image, you're actually licking salt. To even the following image from that, the 4th image, where you yourself serve as a salt lick, which is, as I was doing this research, this is an image that I realized that I've been carrying with me for a very, very long time since I was a student. I remember these images very, very vividly. So even here, this way of thinking about mark making in a way that kind of releases the artist necessarily from a certain amount of decision making with the hand is really, really present.
Yeah, it's so great what you said about marking the body. And I feel like I hadn't really pursued or thought of that, but the relinquishing of the hand has been something that I was very interested in this work, which was a 3-part video work. I wanted to move a character myself, a fictional character, from east to west by going west. And so I just chose among the many points 3 that I filmed at. And the first was a shoot in my studio then at Chinatown, where I swam through 2,000 pounds of MSG that we had dumped into the studio in a large toxic lake. And so I swam for several hours in a performative work. And the next piece, I was transported to, for instance, Utah, to the salt desert, the Bonneville salt flats, where they would run the record speed cars right on the GPS coordinates of that track, where this linear effort would go for naught into something that was meant to be cycled and beaten again as a record. And then finally, in this odd kind of cyclical interrupted patterning, covered in salt as a result of all of this energy expenditure, I sat as a kind of quasi-Buto salt lick, waiting for 10 days for these elk to come and get the idea that I started with into reality, like into their bloodstreams. So the concept or conceit was, how do we transport an idea into reality, into hyper-reality, and so on.
You mentioned that the final piece took 10 days, but how long did the trilogy take you?
That was over the course of about a year, probably.
Okay.
Seasonally, yeah. The sitting on the side of the mountain, though, it's really, it was really, the scale of the elk were incredible. I mean, they were so visceral. Everything that I'm talking about sounds so kind of lofty, perhaps, and ethereal, but the fact of sitting alone, covered in nothing but malt syrup and salt, and facing, after 9 days of delirium, running out of food and water, triggering remote cameras, only aware that someone was changing the camera, hopeful that someone was changing the batteries in the cameras from remotely, and feeling very vulnerable and delirious when this giant muscle finally came and, touched the skin, licking away salt and syrup, as well as the red ants that were swarming all over my body at that time. There was nothing like that, kind of to realize you are where you are.
Michael is indulging me here because, of course, the very first question that I asked him is, how big are those elk? Because they're absolutely enormous.
That's good enough.
Yeah, that's good. I think too, what's interesting is, of course, you have the bites from the red ants, but you also have, of course, tiny little cuts from swimming through the MSG, and then also as you lick through the salt flats, your tongue is being worn away by this material that's exceptionally rough, even though it looks so beautifully smooth. And here too is another way that we can really start to think about indexicality and the ways that works in your practice. You spoke to me quite a bit about scar tissue and the way that accident or action can leave its own mark on your body. And there too, the scar tissue is this index of your practice.
Yes, definitely. The scar tissue that's generated is an index. And I think what's interesting to me is that's the physical evidence. And maybe there's something of that in my interest in sculpture, or my interest in manifesting the artworks at the point that they might be viewable. And this practice could go on and on and on in many ways, but there are moments where there is evidence, and that evidence to me isn't an end to itself. It does, the scar even, I think the compound tibial fracture I have points to a point where I compensated after that moment, or after the healing, every bit of my own body movement. So everything changed, and the rest of the things recalibrated the rest of my own body. So I think there's a kind of point or a nexus at that evidence point of change and transformation. That's my dog.
Hi. You mentioned the scientific method, which is perfect, because this was actually my next question for you. So often in reviews and write-ups about your work, the author talks about your interest in science. And this is something that developed, of course, as part of your upbringing. And so I'll be curious for you to talk about that. But then also, if you could just talk a little bit about the scientific method and just how you might think through that analogy to your practice. For example, how do you know which idea you want to pursue from all of these things that are kind of swirling around in your process?
Mm. I'd say, it probably, there might be an overarching, certainly the language I use comes from, where I was formally trained, and in many ways the environment I grew up in, which was the lab. And both my parents were scientists, but they diverted in their own pathways. My mother more towards plant physiology and food security as a reconstructive efforts for Korea post-war. And my father went off to animal breeding. So, in many ways he became a Korean cattleman, and as much a animal husbandry expert as he was a business person. And so in those ways, I grew up inside of these laboratories, but always there was a kind of not utilitarian, but kind of idealistic end to the pursuit of that science, which was feeding people. I know that, we differed a lot in the methodologies of the day, and that came about with, that led to GMO and, all these kinds of other kinds of interference with hybrids and things. But at the end of the day, I understood their position on this. And so there was always a kind of a function. And that's one of the fields I went into early on before art was, with very low level work with a seed science company. And I'd say that in the science, as far as the science is concerned, it's really this part of the scientific research is the asking of a question. And I think that's where the work will start. The question is there, but sometimes the question will take the form of an impossible image. Sometimes it tends to be within structure or within something I see in a pattern. And that pattern can be, primarily I'm drawn, I find, to those liminal spaces as the backdrop for these patterns. And that's just something, I wasn't aware of when I was doing it. I think over the years, it becomes more evident, in one's body of work. What I do know was the method and the methodology, just how the process begins, and then the habitual kind of process I'll begin with. But in order to not have it follow too closely with the issues I do have with science, which are at the point where the proof is the point where it's not end, but kind of manifestation, perhaps not in the best way, takes place. And so I'm interested in potential and possibilities. And so, you know, that's where it definitely diverts. And maybe that's where, you know, it becomes not functional, not useful as we understand it, but also perhaps not prescribed or completely predictable. And that's definitely not something that's favored by the scientific method, is a lack of predictability. And so, but again, like we talked about before, I do see there being proof in a way. There's a kind of pursuit and research and analysis of everything that's happened. For instance, with figuring out one of your questions you asked earlier, the idea of materiality. I think for me, it's important. And increasingly, you know, we're all aware of the kind of, you know, what things are made of, or we have a real interest in what our physical world is made of, even as, you know, kind of cutting edge science and physics tells us all that basis for things is kind of a little more blurry than we once thought. And so it's interesting how, you know, science is you know, at its best is ahead in a way. And we do catch up and it becomes part of our lives in another way.
You said something that really struck me about this pursuit of an impossible image, or the impossible image that happens to your mind as you're thinking through your ideas and starting to begin a piece and seeing it through. What do you do when you hit an impossible image?
I think when I hit an impossible image, you know, I find an analog maybe, and it's not a compromise. For instance, the image we're looking at now, I was given permission to work with the Rockefeller Collections, work by the Asia Society. This is a work that was commissioned by them. And in this particular kind of intervention with their collection, I saw these amazing holdings, you know, of priceless kinds of works that were, again, collected and stashed away, put away, and they weren't on view. And so I wanted to get us a little closer to these as objects, but also closer to this particular figure, which was a Gandharan Buddha from the 3rd century, which to me seemed very influenced by Western sculpture at the time. And I thought one way we could get closer viscerally is to allow a cricket or insects to climb all over the face of this sculpture. And even the thought of that in pre-production meetings was absolutely sent off fire alarms all through the museum. And so that impossible image of a single insect crawling across the face of this sculpture within the institution was an impossible image. So the result was, what is the insect's eye like? You know, how does it see? And what would it have seen? So it was a shift in perspective. And so it didn't seem logical. It's not a logical jump, but the solution for me in rerouting was to put the cameras back in on the face, 50 of them that see at the same time, and allow us to see at the same time. Maybe not necessarily like an insect, but in a way, the pathway was through that original idea. And so in a sense, this fractured image perhaps was, for me, a more satisfactory and expansive solution, because you know, using 100 mirrors and monitors fragmented the face as well as the viewer, and brought us all together outside the figure in the service of looking more closely at the center. And so there's one example.
It's a really wonderful installation as well, not just because of the close-ups that we're able to see on the screens that are, of course, all over this picture, right? And they're all behind the sculpture, which permits us to get, for example, up close to the face of the sculpture, which is so exceptionally important, and yet something that, of course, we're generally not allowed to do, right? Because, of course, so often artworks are positioned slightly above us so that we can't touch them too clearly. But also this sort of veil that surrounds the Buddha's head causes us actually to look at it more closely, or to attempt to look at it more closely. So we're kind of like actually attempting to see through this armature into this thing that is the real thing.
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea. That this veil was like a space helmet to me.
Yeah.
And actually, it was in the title. And Peter Sheldall, in writing about it, hated the title. I think he called it a silly title. And it was really silly title aside. I feel like he understood the piece. But it was interesting that this space helmet to me was actually done in not in complete collaboration, but with the help of the Buckminster Fuller Institute at the time over in I think it was in Williamsburg. And, and so that led to a discussion with the people that work there, and obviously collaborators of Buckminster Fuller. And so this is, to me, it's interesting that this veil, so to speak, is a very dense veil.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's dense for kind of the way it's made and what it is, but visually it's very light. The Asia Society were so great about letting this hover over them. So in taking measurements and, kind of really carefully getting this piece to float over the, suspended over the sculpture itself was a big deal for me.
And how did you want the viewer to experience this piece? Did you want people to walk around? Did you want them to stand in front of the piece and really attempt to engage with the sculpture itself? What was your hope for the piece?
No, it's a really theatrical piece. And I think for me, it was unusually theatrical, meaning, I guess you could say with the scale of some of the installations I do, there's a certain element of that. But to me, there's an artifice, but it's not the artifice of the caloric figures. It's not a stamping. I wanted there to be something that you have to process. And so as one's eyes, I think, adjusted to the light, I wanted that whole kind of image to be absorbed kind of at once. There was the center point was more lit. So I hoped only that, like with most of my work, that something is recognized, I think. And that recognition brings you, if not physically closer, at least makes you look around it. And usually what you look at points back in a contextual way to forming clues to what that is, or how it's built, or why it is. Why it is. And then in this case, hopefully you take away what it brings back to you, or how you were implicated in that. But it's not meant to be seen in any kind of prescriptive way.
Right.
You could walk all around it.
One of the our participants actually just put a question in chat that I saw just pop up, who asked, was the work silent?
Yes, it was. That's a great question. It was very silent, and we put in carpeting and everything to deaden the sound as well.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Okay. Really absorbed, and everything was painted black. So again, very theatrical, but the effect was to really get you to focus on yourself, your own presence when you're in this space.
And I assume too that the carpeting helped to not just dampen sound of footsteps, but to dampen the footsteps themselves too. So I'm assuming then that the halo didn't shake very much, or did it?
No, it didn't at all. It was absolutely shock absorbed and isolated. Yeah. But what was great is that what you bring up is so interesting. I think the idea that your very footstep was kind of muffled, and so your own kind of the way your body records the way you move through that space was kind of muffled and distanced, and that I think that has a lot of bearing on where some of the recent things I've been working on, which had a lot to do with that, hapticality and a lot of touch, and intimacy, and how we gauge our presence by where we are, and how that's changed right now, especially in this context.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me to think about just walking through the space and suddenly being aware that you aren't making sound. And so then you become very aware of yourself and your body, right? Just then that also kind of then reverberates out to thinking about, for example, the very important iconography of the footstep of the Buddha and things like that. It's such a really, really replete piece. It's so rich. So you mentioned the haptic, which is, again, perfect, because my next question was, in fact, about material and your use of materials. And I think that in your approach, we could consider this to be somehow related to scientific inquiry. And I started thinking about it this way based on something that you mentioned to me yesterday, which is that a material approach can be a way of growing knowledge, which I think is such a wonderful way of thinking about science, of course, yes, but also about artwork. This idea of it, really expanding our minds and allowing us to acquire knowledge of things. So could you tell us a little bit about just your material decision making?
Yeah, I think in the image we were just on, that particular work has a, for example, is based upon research again and in visiting liminal spaces. And I've long been interested, for instance, in birds and bird migration. And one of the things that I was looking at with the imagery of the cranes that I had grown up with, that are very traditional symbols in Korea, but also very traditional symbols of conservation and of kind of put threats to special extinction. I had been looking at wildlife and organisms and animals that would actually occupy and move through these spaces that were unverified. Their movement may not have been completely verifiable, but they were very real. So in that work, graphite and urethane casts were made of samples collected by British colonial explorers in Korea from that region, pre-DMZ, and cast into graphite. And those particular variants have, varieties have probably gone now, but those casts were then, every time they're installed, graphite leaves a mark and a portion of itself behind. So in a way, there is a process just by the act of installation for the particularities of it that's about, kind of mimicking what's happening, kind of the destruction of the piece itself, very slowly, maybe elegantly, but it's really based upon a parallel and, looking at the material.
Madeline, if you could go back to slides 16 and 17.
Oh, thanks.
This is what you were talking about, right, Michael? So, we can just barely make out on the screen, I think, that there are these lines that are coming down from the top of the screen down. And then, Madeline, if you could move to 17. We just skipped it. That's so interesting. Is it missing?
Yeah, that's okay. I think there's shows what I was talking about.
Okay.
The way the crane legs look, but I think that one can get an idea. But what I kind of extrapolate from that is, again, like the hub of the tissue is looking further. This kind of continued investigation of an interest in migration and movement. Is applicable to other kinds of sites and places. So in the next image, for instance, kind of pursuing that path of movement, I was looking at movement of water through desert systems and migration of people. So I was looking at old ancient irrigation systems in the UAE, this near Sharjah. And in the next image, and that's a present day. In the next image, ancient ones that are being excavated from the desert, which were the reason for these other movements and migration. So even as the water went away and left the desert, over long periods of time, the water that was brought in and the fact of their drying up then led to the further migration of people. And so in the next image, working with that mapping system, I would map these irrigation systems, the ancient ones merged with the recent local ones, into interventions into the port warehouses where migrant workers were working and squatting. And in those buildings, that would then, on the next image, lead up to the foundations of the building itself, pointing back to the hands that made it, which were the same workers, and up the wall, up finally into the larger installation, which is the next image, I think. Again, a silver nitrate, silvered developing of the texture of the wall, which to me revealed all the hands and revealed its making, but combined with all the light from the space, amplifying presence, which is something that the silver also does. And another thing that I could get into the kind of, nerd physics of ad infinitum, but I won't bore everyone with the minutiae. But there is something in that idea of investigating, for instance, why photography for me and why an image? And then its materiality, which one could see is actually based in a very early science experiment. If you ever work in a laboratory or study science, that involves silvering. And merging processes I learned in Venice, for instance, from Murano glassmakers of mirroring glass with the laboratory techniques that I'd learned, and then overlaying them onto silver gelatin printing and early silver prints, and trying to come up with something that results in an approach that I could approach in a very perhaps angular but not necessarily roundabout way. A kind of image making or practice, or image referential practice, lexical, I guess.
Yes. This is a piece that I've only ever seen in reproduction, so I was not able to attend this exhibition. And so I'm really curious about it. Were people allowed to walk through the exhibition?
Yes, they were allowed to walk through it, and it was open all night. And so it was lit by mercury halide lights. It was a really eerie oasis of sorts. And that we allowed, with a lot of difficulty, people to continue to occupy the space in the upper floors that were working there. And as long as it was kept relatively clean. So it did have a kind of itinerant population, daytime usually.
Wow.
Some nights. So it was occupiable space.
That's really, really interesting to hear about. I was actually wondering about, I'm trying to imagine this piece being installed in the United States and all of like the crash barriers that would be placed around all of the dips in the concrete, and where the foundation is revealed. You would definitely have a stanchion or a piece of glass or something like that, so that nobody could step on it, accidentally over the side. And so it's really, really interesting to think about not just being able to inhabit the space in the way that we talk about that as art people, but that people inhabited the space.
That's really interesting. Yes, that is really interesting. And it did follow a lot of the cycle of a building with that identity. It was a semi-used but privately owned warehouse. And as it was being squatted and fell out of use, or there was a desire to change function, it was destroyed. So a couple of years later, I got an image from someone in the region, in the area, in Sharjah, of where the piece was. And it was channels, it was ruins, and it's been kind of reabsorbed by the site. And so now it is this flat place with with evidence rather, of this drawing.
Really wonderful. That actually, again, is just like the perfect segue for me. Thank you. To ask you about this idea of site specificity, and the importance of site specificity to you. Obviously, we've just been speaking about it, but so much of your practice is either meant to be installed in a particular place, or it's drawn from a particular place and the evocations that place provides for you. And then I assume you're hoping to provide for your viewer. And, it's interesting because in your practice, I think we could understand it as being multifocal. So we could understand site specificity as migration, as movement. These are two of your words that you wrote to me this morning. And even a moment in time, if we think about temporality as a site-specific work. So, we could think about your work at Sharjah or the DMZ or fossils as being site-specific.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great lead in from you to this image, actually, and this project that's on screen now. The shot just previous of the two bridges, I think, speaking of time and temporality and evidence, are two bridges. One was, it was called the Friendship Bridge, and it was, I believe, initiated by the North Korean. It went at the time when the border was at a different place, and completed by the U.S. Corps of Army Engineers as the movement of the borders and occupied territory changed. And so this is a very particular architecture from a particular vision, you know, of another regime, of another government. And then the bridge next to it, which coexists because the one to the left is deemed unsafe, is the new Friendship Bridge, which is actually usable, and it exists at the same time. And now what we see on the right is the new and improved Friendship Bridge coexisting in the same physical crossing of the river. That will be the new functional bridge, making the others obsolete. And so the history of this bridge is, you know, crossing of the Han River is on record at the same time, but also displaying the kind of different shifts. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting to me. This is a point where for instance, my mother crossed on this river from north to south in the late 40s. And at this point on the river, the context was incredibly important to me because it wasn't just a personal reason, but one of the things I'm interested in with the scar tissue and the liminality, or the kind of social ecologies even that develop, the realities that develop around living in such places. Maybe the animals have a particular kind of identity and role, indexically, and in a way the people that exist are another very real, and the social lives they kind of lead are very real new histories, and I think they will also teach us something. And so in desire to study this, I worked with a number of school kids in the region that live on the DMZ to collect rocks, which are one of the few things that geologic things that do move in our own lifetime, other than earthquakes, I guess, and such. But one example is rocks through siltation as they move down a river system. And the Han goes up and down in every way but north and south, even as it crosses from north to south. And at this point in the river, we explored at the bridges and collected samples that were then, in the next image, I guess were,
yep.
Sorry, we move to the next image. Mm-hmm. Collected, and they collected these small rock samples and played a children's game called Tang Tang Moki, which is basically a territorial game. And so they'll throw a rock and create a geometric pattern, and the one with the biggest, the goal is to eat and consume the other territories. And so I had the kids play this game with these volcanic rocks on the original Friendship Bridge. And then again, in the next slide, took them to a place they can't normally access, which is the Peace Plaza, about 100 yards from the DMZ within the kind of military occupied zone. And so on that plaza, I had the children play that game as well and recorded their pathways of the much larger territories that they were doing. And in the next image, we then took the samples that they'd collected and scanned them. And in the next image, we composited them into a large scale cement cast version of the singular rock that we then put in the next image into site at the Peace Plaza, which is a plaza for the future, really. It's a plaza that's not occupied yet. So my interest in, which is not usually tend towards monuments, was a monument that wasn't about the past, but a monument that was yet in formation and had an unclear identity. And I felt that was a good analog to looking at the deep past in a way. Rocks and pebbles that might have come from, an unknown volcano, that in the north that flowed down to the south. And these are the kind of discussions I had with the children about, for them to talk with their parents about and to use as a hub for talking about the reality that is beyond their reach as well, which is their grandparents' movement, down through that system. And in the next instance, that site in which the forms are generated directly was put into the plaza. And I think it's in the next couple of images, amidst other locally sourced rocks, in a kind of mapped constellation pattern that followed the points of the children's territories that were all painted with local ceramic glazes. So there's a kind of installed presence.
It's really, really beautiful.
And about 100 yards are thousands of mines and the world's most heavily guarded ecological preserve.
Yeah, that's, I don't even know really how to process that. I guess that for me is an impossible image. So Michael, we are at 1:49. And so before I turn it over to questions and answers, I just wanted to see if there were any works that you particularly wanted to tell us about or to share with us.
Well, we could jump to the last images, which begin with the first of the single breath transfer works.
Okay, so here we are.
Actually, if we go back a couple more, there's just two things that we'll talk about really quickly.
Yeah, please.
And one is this group of works. If we go back one more. And this is, a work from a very recent series called the Single Breath Transfer Works. And in thinking of all of these places that were so external and that were so site dependent, I had a lot of return recently to thinking about the body and thinking about the site that we occupy here as well, and how things are transferred and transmitted. And one of the things we talked about was knowledge, and I'm very interested in how something is passed on to another. And as a sculptor that sometimes, an artist that sometimes uses fabricators, I've always had an uneasy relationship personally to where the bounds are of where the work exists. And I don't mean uneasy in an uncomfortable, unresolved way, but it's an interesting point that I like to address. And in this case, I collected bags from the street in the next image to inflate with my own breath. The image just before was an image of some of the imagery, digital thermal imagery of the lungs undergoing a test called the single breath transfer test, which is a measurement of the body's ability to absorb toxins in the air. And in that single breath transfer test, which is taking a breath of carbon monoxide, is kind of the origin of this piece. So there's another way that a piece was led into, was a medical test, a diagnostic test. And that's another thing that's, again, part of my life in the present. And that test then, in my own leap, was to imagine how that would be transferred. And so I collected bags from outside bodegas and on the street of New York, and then would inflate them to the limit of my own breath, my own single breath, and then quickly froze them with either liquid nitrogen or wax. And in the next image, you can see those forms, and then quickly had a mold made in ceramic and passed it on to the glass blower, who then put his or her breath into the glass, the molten glass, which expanded and burned out the bag inside of the ceramic mold. And in the next images, and again, yes, we would take them out, and again, and then you can go through the rest of them at liberty, resulted in these shells. And these shells are, in a way, a record and a metric, like a gauge. So I wanted to make vases, but the way I made them was as records of that transfer. And so, in a sense, the glass for me, in being its frozen state of this liquid material in this particular present time and temperature and physical condition, is a gauge of age. The vase that's also a record of transmission, and maybe the passing on of one thing to another, one person to another, one human.
Mm-hmm. These are really, really fascinating to me. I have so many just like weird nitpicky questions about them. like, did you clean the bags first?
Recently more so than in the past, yes. A little reckless, perhaps.
I think it's also really interesting
Yeah.
too, for those of our participants who are glass blowers or who have watched glass blowing. It's an intensely physical process, and glass blowers are very much akin to athletes or to singers, where they have great control over their breath. And so this too was a question that I had for you, was just like, how do you feel like your breath compared to the breath of the glass blowers you were collaborating with?
That's a great question, because it's obviously nothing compared to their abilities. One of the glass blowers I work with could probably blow up a 30-gallon drum with his own breath. I could barely blow up some of these bags. So, but I felt it was appropriate, because it was scaling down a material, and what the material is asking of you is also something I'm responsive to and aware of. I think sometimes I ask the question of the material in order to push it, but that's as close to research as it gets, and as close to science, because I think what I'm really listening for is how it's pushing back. And in that process, finding out where we might go with it that's not yet been explored, and what it might mean to us, because it is something that perhaps we've chosen to be preoccupied with.
Right. Some of them possess color too. Is this found color, or is this a decision that you're making?
That's overlaid, and that's a decision, and they're usually based on the bags themselves, but they're done with a very technical Swedish, what's called a Swedish overlay for the glass blowers out there, who will know that it's a very, very tricky process. And one of the fellows over, a couple of the people at Wheaton Arts were really helping us out with this, and kind of showed us this technique of laying literally a bar of color glass, embedded, really impregnated color into the glass, rather than pigmenting the glass, and actually blowing through it, so this color merges with the glass and is what's stretched. So it's hard to kind of, it might sound a little too grand the way I'm describing it, but it's really quite a marvel.
They're really, really stunning. I love the installation shot too. It must have been really wonderful to walk among them.
Thanks. I'm amazed that everyone is still here, and thank them. But if they'll humor me with a couple more images, I'll close with this. But
okay.
If we went to image 34, I thought that I would start with, actually 34, one prior. With the work I've been doing with trying to bring fossil sections together, I've been looking at mapping uncontestable land and 500 million year old landscapes, and seeing if I could bring this land back together again for something we could actually touch, something we could experience again, like the body obfuscata, something that would bring us closer to something that we can't comprehend or really process or empathize with. There's that rock that you're talking about. And that has led me more recently into working with the digital platforms at the Smithsonian Open Access program, where they've opened up all of their files. And in the next image, all of their three-dimensional image files in image 35 led me to the life cast, one back, of Anne Sullivan, Helen Keller's teacher. And there was a life cast, which I think is very different than a death mask. And this life cast of Anne Sullivan was fascinating to me as the teacher of Helen Keller, because in some way, by touching the vibration points, the movement, texture of her teacher's face, Anne Sullivan was able to, or Helen Keller was able to receive or create, generate language. And so this haptic moment was incredibly important. But what went on there is absolutely, we still don't know what happens when the touch is received and how it's processed by us, by the human, and what it results in. And there is something in there in the art about that, to me, in that it's not a leap. There's something that very specifically that goes on, but it's pretty incredible, the leap that's made. And in the next image, one of the things in manifesting such a thing was looking at those points as the reason and the fact of a build. So a digital 3D print can't be built without being based upon an anchor to the ground. It's built on something. And those were key to the points of touch on Anne Sullivan's face. And finally, that transmission, I think, results in an oversized, finally, on the last image, ceramic cast or porcelain cast that is a very topographic record of this, again, visage. And as a teacher and as a parent, I think that a lot of that transmission and knowledge and has, pretty more positive resonances than the kind of transmission we're looking at right now.
That is such a beautiful way of ending our discussion. Thank you so much. So I will turn it over to JC and we'll have some questions for Michael.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, thank you both. That was incredible. I don't want to take up too much time, but I have to just, your work on the DMZ reminds me of the American border with Mexico. And the way you talk about new histories and new identities reminds me, of course, of Gloria Anzaldua's La Frontera Borderlands work and the idea of the mestiza, and that there's this, the border itself is kind of its own place. And I'm fascinated by the correlation between the DMZ being a heavily guarded, as you say, ecological preserve, and the American-Mexican border being completely under attack by the same. There's this precarity between protection and destruction that should those mines go off, right, it no longer is that protected place. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
That's fascinating. I think that those borders are the stakes of those borders and the kind of forces that are used to enforce or create the powers on each side have changed or are shifting. And I think, there's one with capital, and then maybe it's generated again by xenophobia, and wherever it's generated or is one of power. And I think that that's what we're looking at in terms of what needs to be diffused. I mean, I think when I hear of soldiers near the DMZ saying that occasionally they'll hear an explosion in the middle of the night, and that some animal has probably stepped on that. And these are very, endangered species. You just think that is such a grossly exaggerated form of obliteration, and that's, I think, it kind of sums up in many ways some of the excesses in these issues and the need to kind of look beyond them and reroute some of these strategies and examine our own kind of version of power.
Absolutely, that's a terrifying image.
It is.
Anyway, sorry, we'll jump to questions now. We have one from the audience that I've been asked to read. And the question is, the ways you explore the presence of absence is so compelling. In addition to scientific inquiry, are you influenced by any philosophical traditions or other theoretical methodologies?
Nothing directly, although, there's it's not a strong conscious kind of decision-making interest, but I think, existentialism obviously inside of this was addressed by me, and I'm interested in it as in language and in terms of how that is played out in language and in literary expressions.
Thank you. The next question comes from Trevor Warren. Trevor, I am going to prompt you to activate your microphone now.
And that was incredibly unsatisfactory answer, but that's one that I think that as it was written out, I'd need to write out my answer as well. So just to even the playing field, maybe I would invite that person to an answer to that, which I will do in writing, in shorthand. And I'm saying that now. I don't know if you guys are going to hate me for saying that, but
no, that's fine. I'm going to hold you to that.
All right.
Soon. Let's see, Trevor, are you there with us?
Yeah, I am.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, Michael, I think you've speaking a lot on kind of entropy and how it's played out in your work, and I just kind of wanted to hear more directly about how you think about that through the process, and then maybe the the final piece, if you ever feel like there is a final piece, and kind of how you manage like some degree of control with entropy and acceptance of like chaos, change, disorder, and if you always feel like your pieces are unpredictable with that as well.
That's really interesting and really germane, I mean, to my present thinking. And I think that, you know, I've always had an interest in how the entropic has been addressed, or how I perceive it's been addressed, and how it's been received in art, and certainly in, you know, in the world, in physics and science, but in art. And I'm interested in kind of looking at other ways that this entropic can be, it's not harnessed, but or evidenced, but investigated. And its presence is undeniable. And the most obvious for me is in, you know, the oxidizing surfaces of the silver nitrate, or, you know, or even the kind of finite nature of the glass's fragility. And there's a kind of always a threat or a promise, however you look at it, of an entropic state. And that could be looked at either positively or negatively. You know, too much is that we see the entropic as a, I think, and not you in particular, Trevor, but that we might see as humans, the entropic as a kind of not a positive state, and one that leads towards a kind of a destruction that again, it leaves unanswered questions, and that's scary. And I think that what's interesting to me about the entropic is, if something is blowing apart, I'd rather catch it in midair and look at it as it's blowing apart, you know, and maybe its directionality is moving one way, but its fate isn't, you know, it doesn't have a context at that point. And I think that in materiality and in realizing a work, if this is at all not getting too vague or abstract, pulling down at that moment and showing evidence along a larger pathway, maybe towards entropy, towards its final resting place, is something I want to intercept. And maybe its end is something I studiously kind of avoid. The kind of final, even in the glass bags, which are some of the most final kinds of complete works I have, I'm really interested in the point of incredible jaggedness at the top, where the glass blower has just broken off from his ball or her ball, the glass punty, or the stick, the air hole. And that glass point is the most resonant part to me, you know? And it's the closest point to the thinnest point of the bag, which is the furthest from me as I blow it, and the furthest from the glass blower, married to the sharpest point, which is also present. Both of those points have potential breakage and destruction, cutting power. So I'm very, if that is not too abstract, I think that looking at different elements of the entropic are interesting to me, but that it's all part of, as in the work, a cycle, and that entropic is motion to me, is movement defined, and is a point. And the work is a smaller, when it's realized or seen to me, is a smaller subset of that movement. Sometimes it's blurrier than others, and sometimes it's clearer, maybe.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you so much for that.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Trevor. Next question is coming from Nettie. Nettie, I'm going to ask to activate your microphone.
Hi. I'm here. You've hit a lot of points that I have far-reaching thoughts about, and somehow some of them have somehow surfaced from my brain from so many years of it's just ancient art, Gandhara. I just because the study of Western and Eastern thought is there, and what you did with science on top of that is fascinating. Entropy, I'm thinking of artists like Robert Smithson, and how he has influenced so many artists, and how he gravitated to land and form, an ancient form as well. But my direct question was about, because I have studied and looked at Scholars Rocks and what it takes to, you know, change the rock to be what it is, and how, say, a place like in Japan, this is a lot, right? We're going around the world. A place like Ryonji, where the rocks are set in a certain way, examinations of how to maybe perceive geographic or souls, as in human beings, or I don't know. What are your thoughts? I mean, there's a lot of thinking here. I just particularly am interested in what were you connected when you did this Peace Plaza, using the idea of volcanic rocks, and of course the empty spaces, I think, of the minds, as you, you know, just if one exploded and how it digs out the negativity, and maybe perhaps those rocks are the positive examples.
I mean, they definitely left incredible spaces when they were removed or displaced. And I think that's a really interesting point about the Scholars Rocks, which I think are fascinating. And I think the idea of them as contemplative objects, but also as incredibly charged, having charged identities is interesting, as well as, for me, how they're formed, the question that's perpetually answered, even though there's something so factual in front of you, something as base as a stone or a rock, that for me, the question of how it got to this way, why it was chosen, all of the things that actually buoy up its meaning, suddenly somehow either brought into being by its context where it's shown, by how it's displayed, its base, or simply by seeing it and passing at the right angle, in context with the gravity, with up and down, inform a series of questions. And so I stopped thinking about what it is. And I think that there's something fascinating in that, in what you're talking about, maybe asking that correlates with my interest in it.
That's something, with this, it just to examine the Scholars Rocks. And I don't know how many years it takes to create, many, many years, right, to get the forms, and talk about entropy. There's the exaggerated version of what I guess you're consolidating the years of the characterization, but also to bring in individuals and young children. I mean, just picking rocks and playing a game, maybe that was a game that's it's so inventive, and speaks to me because I also teach, but it's just generally to pass on as you are, mention the future. Maybe that's, in the haptic, as you mentioned, with the future of these individuals, these younger people, and how you're passing something along to them in any way, connecting your thoughts or what is in you as maybe physically, in the landscape, in that digging out of the earth and placing it in the positive is something of us, or this is a connection. This is what it's just the soul, and the soul of the Ganhara also is, there's something that exhibits the West and the East, the connection of how one is posed. But I'm not certain of that. I'm going to leave that for a second. I'm just, but I just think that the idea of the scope of how we are in Earth or not in Earth, or how we are just, dust or more than dust, and how we exist.
Yeah, I have a draw for you. Oh, sorry, Nettie, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to, I'm just thinking of the presence. The presence. Here I am talking to you.
I think it does on both multiple levels too, doesn't it, in a way? And I think, if I could sum up an answer in a way to your, multi-layered question is, to match my multi-layered presentation work is, we talked about the cyclical, Amanda and I, and it exists in one level like this. And I think we've seen it evolve into this. And I love the idea of revolving it until we understand it as this, you know. And if we understand it in that new dimension, just by turning it over, what exists, then maybe we can get a new perspective. And I think some of that is what you're talking about. It's like looking at that hole a little deeper is just by turning it over sometimes and not wondering where it comes from or why, but how it changes what we think about it.
Yes. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Nettie, for your question. We got time for maybe one more question. We're going to go over to Cal. Cal, I'm going to ask you to activate your mic.
Hi, Michael. I was wondering what you think of the vitrine work of Damien Hirst, and if you see any comparison, any common ground.
Well, we were very, you know, we came up very contemporary of each other, and so we were aware of practices and visited studios and shared, you know, discussion. But I think, to me, what's interesting generationally is, you know, we come from a time when we watched, you know, our parents had dealt with things like polio and smallpox, and we came to an age where we would suddenly walked on the moon, and the disease culture had turned to cancer, and it was, you know, very invisible and inside us, and we had to recalibrate how we thought of such things. I hate to use something so morbid, but I think we're here right now.
And I'm talking about Hearst.
Yeah, and another, yeah, right, in the time of COVID. And I think, and another level, the following generation, or even within our generation, we watched an AIDS epidemic, and we watched another level, the social enter a dimension, you know, a dimension of ourselves, of our bodies. And I think that in some ways, all of those transitions play into some of the realities that we looked at, and that some artists that shared some kind of examinations of the role, you know, science or language or some of the hallmarks of observation investigation took. And, you know, it wasn't, you know, Paul Tech, it was hyper examining, you know, there was a little less, there was a different poetry in work, and maybe it was more destructive. Some of those terms I would see could maybe also be applied to me, because there are elements of the entropic that tend to look darker and maybe more like they're moving, contrary to what I said, towards the darker end, rather than simply being caught in midair. But other than that, there's no conscious, you know, kind of affinity, other than, you know, there's in those works a shared kind of interest or use of this kind of vitrine or cabinet of curiosity kind of structure. In the ones that I've used, I definitely have always paid attention to there not being four sides to this, or six sides, five sides to this vitrine. Six sides, yes. It's always in a state of disassembly or incompletion. And so that frame that looks at the work, the lens we're supposed to look at, is, again, questionable.
Thank you, Michael. Cal, thanks for that question. I think this is probably a good time to go to our poet. I just want to point out we've had some nice back and forth in the chat. And also the artist Lauren Bond pointed out that this year is the 75th anniversary on July 16th of the atom bomb being dropped in the deserts of the Southwest, where the Bonneville Salt Flats are. So there's definitely some resonance of absence and presence with that work and where we're at today. Thank you, Lauren, for pointing that out. Okay, so we're going to go, let's see, sorry, I'm gonna calibrate myself. Our poet today is Sharon Mesmer. We have a tradition of closing our lunch with a poem. This is lunchtime. Sharon Mesmer is a poet, a fiction writer, essayist, and teacher. Her most recent poetry collection, Greetings from My Girly Leisure Place, Bloof Books, was voted Best of 2015 by Entropy magazine. Other collections are Annoying Diabetic Bitch, The Virgin Formica, Half Angel, Half Lunch, and Vertigo Seeks Affinities. 4 of her poems appear in Postmodern American Poetry in a Norton anthology, 2nd edition, and she has also published 3 fiction collections, including Ma vie a Yonago from Hachette in French translation. Her essays and reviews and interviews have appeared in New York Times, New York Magazine, the Paris Review, American Poetry Review, and the Brooklyn Rail, among others. She teaches in the undergraduate and graduate programs of NYU and the New School. Her awards include a Fulbright Specialist Grant, a Jerome Foundation Mentoring Award, and 2 New York Foundation for the Arts fellowships. Wow, Sharon, amazing. I am gonna ask you to activate your microphone. Hi, Sharon, you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, there you are. Hello.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say that, Amanda, that was a great interview. That was just really wonderful. And Michael, what you said in your work is so inspiring, and I made tons of notes. So I just want to say I'm really happy to be a part of this. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to read 3 really short poems, and I'm going to time it. If 2 of them end at the 7-minute mark, then I will stop. But hopefully I'll get all 3 in. And these are sort of, you know, I went and looked, Michael, at your work, and I tried to find some things that fit. I don't know if they will, but hopefully. So the first one is called Who is the Hero of the Quar? And the quar is what the kids are calling the quarantine. Who is the hero of the quar? For Gaia Thomas. Who is the hero of the quar? The hero is the apartment. The apartment is keeping me right at night. Me is a startled, sudden consumer of bodega bonbons with kitchen hair and a fan. Right, because I've been stuck listening to I is the it word in core radio increments. But I listen differently, testy lovies. I pair kitchen hair with anything I tangle into takeaway. Whatever is sleep making cannot 500% kitchen hair posse me, because the kitchen is all in. And so far, the large Japanese kitchen shears are getting bigger every minute, very painting the big world bigger every minute. Once the hoping is done, there will be quar smoothies, just watch out. And so I'm mayo, I'm verdict. A verdict I'm okay with. And I'm also done wondering if I'm changed. I'm changed. I'm better. I'm a quar hero with quar kitchen hair and listening differently. I'll keep growing my ripping large kitchen hair into I is the it word increments. I'll do it for the apartment. Then I'll box it up. Right, I'm boxing it up now. And quar hair, kitchen hair is what you get when you cut your own hair during a quarantine. Some of us are doing that, I included. This is called My Supper Had a Song Inside, and it's part of a manuscript I'm working on called Even Living Makes Me Die, which is in response to 35 underknown women poets of the Americas. So I research their lives and their work, and I write a poem for them, and I include biographical information about them. And My Supper Had a Song Inside is after Violeta Parra, Chile, 1917 to 1967, with a last line by Hakuin. My supper had a song inside. My song was the world before the sweet gum trees. The trees were hidden inside the earth. The earth was inside an alphabet. My meat was rain and a maple tree. My maple tree was the alphabet inside the earth. The earth was an ancient lamp still burning in an urn. The urn, a moon of corn, a fleet of deer. I never wondered, will there always be a song inside supper? Was there always a place like this? A place with a sweet gum tree at the beginning of everything, a sweet gum tree made of rain? To grow old, I was told to bind rain with stones, to burn sweet gum to ash for a spell, to become lush, elemental with frank allure, to think only of days to come. Now my meat is rain on the windowsills. My alphabet is wet cement. A fleet of bikes crashes past the gas station. I feel my way toward them with my tongue. And I wonder, is there still a song inside supper? Still a world burning in an urn? If there is still an alphabet, there must be an earth inside the coal and the ash. And the last poem I'm going to read is called Privates of the Popular Apocalypse. And it's after Laurie Jackson, US 1962 to 1990. I didn't die young enough, but I am coiffed and wired on broken linoleum. Your fingers seeding me like dragon teeth, my clavicle bruised in freight yard dusk, a parentheses of grease on the ceiling of the Y. So what if it's true? The clavicle is the body's only long horizontal bone. And the stuff a young girl does to make a man a hero cuts a low, keening moan amid the moon and ablutions. But hey, weren't we discussing linoleum, the ceiling of the Y, bald, bright July? And would it hurt to fall asleep as the coach house smolders, my face all twisted, but recognizably me? Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. Your work was amazing too.
Thank you all for coming. Sharon, Michael, Amanda, thank you for making this a wonderful afternoon. As y'all know, today, and tomorrow we have Carrie Moyer and Sheila Pepe joining us, which should be incredible. And that's all. You all have the ability to unmute yourselves if you'd like to say goodbye on your way out. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, guys.
Thank you, Sharon and Michael.
I love this poem.
Great.
Thank you, Sharon.
Michael, thank you, Amanda. You're brilliant.
Love the reading. Thank you so much.
Sharon, thank you.
Thank you,
This was
Bob.
wonderful. I'm so glad I got to be involved.
Bye, Lauren.
Really inspiring.
Guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you again.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye,
Frank.
everybody. Thank you.